Right, so if we move on quite quickly, because I know time is short, this session I'm just going to give a brief introduction about the sort of practices that we are trying, if you like, to encourage in terms of developing engagement. I'm also going to define learner engagement and autonomy, after I've been asking you to define what student being engaged might look like. And then we look at, if you like, a case study, which is for my own practice, looking at a case study of final year students, and it's, I'll give you the context, the methodology, the analysis, and some recommendations at the end. And I hope we'll have, well, we should have 5 minutes for questions. I won't be able to take really questions. It's not as interactive as I would have liked to be. It's not a flipped lecture. but hopefully, and I might, sort of go through some of the slides fairly quickly, because that's essentially is my life's work. And it would be quite difficult to give you an idea in 20 minutes. So first of all, an introduction of the sort of practices that, if you like, would enable us to, sort of motivate students. So, a student-centered approach to promote successful learning through engagement and motivation. We also need to remember that learning is essentially interactive and dialogic, and it's important also to align, obviously, assessment with learning and teaching practices, and that's what we need to remember. So if you've got learning and teaching practices that are very interactive, and all the students have to do at the end is that that's misaligned in many ways, although examples about their value. So, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Learner engagement. So how would you, just a word that where you would identify that a learner is engaged, what would you look in learners to think that they're engaged? Any?
Enthusiasm. Enthusiasm.
Enthusiasm, yes.
Attentive.
Attentive, yes.
To attend.
Pardon?
To be attend.
That they attend, yes. Attentive and there, yes.
Awake.
Right.
Awake.
Awake.
Questioning.
Questioning, right. Anything else? No? Right. So now to the definitions of learner engagement that are found in the literature. And it talks about meaningful student involvement in the development of their own learning. So that's a little bit beyond the sort of thing that we were talking about. It's not just about, sort of attending or even enthusiasm. It's actually being completely engaged in the process itself. And then the description of the students, so they can be identified through sustained involvement in learning and positive emotion. And this is where positive emotion is an important part. Emotions are an important part of the learning experience. And they're also willing to initiate activities when given the opportunity. Okay, so I found these two definitions are quite useful, but they go beyond just the student turning up, attending, or even being enthusiastic and questioning. It's that overall involvement in their own learning. So how can we engage students? So in the definition previously, we've got to make sure that they have their willing to take part in the activity. And my own research has been for a long time around the concept of learner autonomy, so where students actually are willing to take that responsibility for their own learning, which, if you like, is linked to engagement. So that is very much aligned to student engagement. But one thing that the definitions of student engagement that I've looked at don't talk about is that in order to be engaged and take the responsibility for their own learning, students have got to be able to do that. So they've got to have the ability as well as the willingness and the opportunity.
By ability, do you mean intellectual or do you mean empowerment?
Right. The opportunity would be empowerment, whilst the ability is the self-confidence, the ability, the metacognitive ability. So that's where I'm coming from. So I would say that the development of autonomy could therefore be seen as crucial to student engagement. Students need to be able as well as willing to engage. Right, so I'll just give you a couple of definitions of learner autonomy. It's essentially students developing that capacity in interactions with peers and teachers, and they've got the psychological and to have the psychological and emotional capacity. And we'll come back to emotions because I think as part of that ability to engage, the students have also got to have the ability to understand, control their own emotions around learning, and that of others as well. So, curriculum implications for engaging students. So you've got the notion of, probably many of you are familiar with the notion of assessment for learning and assessment as learning. Can I just have a show of hands so that, you know, it's a bit interactive, of people who are very familiar with these notions? So essentially, it's instead of using assessment as a vehicle for measurement of achievement, you use assessment as a vehicle for learning. Okay? This assessment process obviously promotes student engagement because it should give them the opportunity to initiate activities, and then they're involved as well in shaping the learning environment. And the actual example I'm going to give you from my own practice is portfolio-based assessment, which I'm sure many of you actually, or some of you use. Can I have a show of hands again of people that might use portfolio-based assessment? So it's you know, sort of quite a familiar development now. So here's my case study. So it's assessment. It's assessment as learning essentially, because the portfolio is actually the framework for the learning. So this is just to give you a bit of background. This is from the languages area. So that is the degree program that they actually do, and the portfolio that I'm going to look at is the final year portfolio. Okay, so you can see from obviously they're language students. From that perspective, they've got already quite a lot of self-confidence in terms of the skills they've developed on placement and the linguistic skills they've developed on placement as well. Oops. Right, so the module aims, just to give you an idea, I'm not going to read those, but you can see that essentially they've got to develop their negotiating skills and also some very specific skills, which are translation and interpreting skills, which from a student perspective are quite difficult skills to acquire from language student perspective. Right, so this is what it looks like, the assessment program here. So we, as you can see, this has been ongoing, and we've got different versions actually within a subject group. But you can see here that what they have is a portfolio which is essentially focusing on the learning process. So they need to do some translation and interpreting tasks, and associated, and that's very important, and we'll come back to what Simon was talking in the lecture this morning, is the idea of self and peer feedback and evaluation. And then, as part of the portfolio, they select some activity which are based on their needs, and they actually also develop a learning log. And then eventually, the proof of the pudding, if you like, are the time constraint translation and interpreting tasks. So you've got the two other assessments which are measures of that learning, and you've actually got the portfolio, which is actually looking at the process and then encouraging the students to learn. Now, the percentages I've given you here are very interesting. It's just the weightings that we've given over the years is assessment. And I've obviously got colleagues, we work as a team, and we've obviously got to do the same assessment in all the languages. So we've always had very interesting discussions as to the value of the portfolio and what sort of weightings that should be given. And over the years, we have given it 70%, 50%, 20%. And you can see how that's, the input, if you like, the outputs, the tasks are varying as well. But the interesting bit for me is that no matter what weightings you gave those tasks, the portfolios, as long as you gave it a slight weighting, the students were engaged. The portfolios were as good if you gave them 70% as if you gave them 20%, which I thought was fascinating. Because you'd have thought that, they'd take, so as long as they're hooked on the activities, and then, they carry on. So that, I thought that was the interesting bit there. And you can see from the criteria, the portfolio criteria, that there is a focus on process. There's a focus on planning, reflection, obviously performance as well, and progression. So the students actually engaging with feedback and demonstrating that engagement through their portfolio. Now, the methodology, so I've looked at the student logs, and obviously this is part of my research area, and I've looked at, are we actually developing the autonomy, engaging the students as part of the portfolio development, and I found this model quite useful in terms of, if you like, the engaged students or the autonomous students. So it's directed attention, which somebody mentioned earlier, reflecting on what they're doing as well, building some metacognitive knowledge, so learning to learn as part of the portfolio development. And the added bit, because these models exist from Benson, but my added bit has been really developing the emotional intelligence. Because you find that when students actually work in groups or work in pairs and give each other feedback, or have to do a joint project, for instance, in the portfolio they've got to do a group translation, you find that actually what causes the problem is not the academic issues, it's actually the emotions. Dealing with conflicts, working together, giving each other feedback. And I think just to let the students get on with it is not necessarily helpful. And most, in fact, an earlier study I did showed that what came across from the student's perspective was very much the emotional side of learning, which, especially in HE, we never consider very much, I don't think. But that's an important part. So here's the other model, is obviously the fact that it's a group, the interaction between learner, the task, and the teacher. So I looked at 40 portfolios, including, and in those portfolios, it's not just written, it's audio, written peer feedback, reflective logs, and what I was looking for really is to see whether they had the ability and the willingness to engage with their learning, so whether they were, engaged students. So this is the sort of things I was looking for in all the materials that I've described here. So emotional intelligence, and that's how it's, if you like, defined, lowering their own anxieties and so on. Task knowledge, that's being able, understanding how you learn, progression, time, the selection and use of cognitive strategies and so on, reflection, and again, attention. So paying attention to the various aspects of the language. So I'm just going to give you some very quick examples of what I found in those portfolios. And you can see here the awareness. Through these portfolios, you can actually encourage the students to articulate what they see, how they understand others' emotions and their own, for instance, which enables, as I say, them to understand better how they work. Dealing with their own anxiety, you can see that another students there. feedback to others on effective strategy. There was an awful lot in these portfolios for some reason about the emotional side, and you can see here how the students is actually not just dealing with the academic errors, but if you like, telling the other students how they might be able to cope with the interpreting class. Again, the effective dimension of collaborative work. And you can see this is quite a positive one. We also had some negative ones. Right, cognitive, metacognitive strategies, so evaluating themselves here. And again, that's another self-evaluation. Feedback to peers about specific aspects. Here you've got some reflections. And interestingly, some of the reflection went beyond the actual portfolio task onto the whole of their studies, which was interesting in itself. And you can see that there's a sort of change of identity here somehow, which is also what we're looking for in language students in many ways. They develop their own identity in that language, in operating professionally in that language. Again, you've got group learning. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to rush through some of these. But obviously they're on the handouts, and I think the actual slides will be available on the website. So, and attention. Attention was very difficult to evidence. You couldn't really see that in the portfolio. The only thing you can say is the fact that they were actually looking at the tasks and things. But in terms of finding evidence in the portfolio, that was quite difficult. Now, in conclusion, you can see that the portfolios encourage two key aspects of learner development. So it's raising awareness in relation to cognitive, metacognitive and effective strategy. And they're developing their strategies in collaboration with others. So they're lessening the dependence on the tutor. And it can be used as a vehicle for learning engagement. And now I'm just going to give you my thoughts about the implications for assessment design principles. So the first one I think is, assessment should engage and motivate through relevant, formative and supportive activities. So I think scaffolding is quite important. And the portfolio work actually provides a framework, not just for tutor feedback, but also for peer feedback. It's very slow. Peer feedback and personal reflection as part of the design. Self-assessment to be introduced as appropriate, as part of the assessment, and then I think a seamless approach to teaching, learning and assessment. So these, I think, in terms of this case study and my own research are the implications. And now some questions and comments on your experience of assessment design.
I think we do the same for contract.
One of some students have difficulties working in groups. Sometimes it's a fifth language or anything as a group. Do you do any sort of preventative interventions or make suggestions, maybe dealing with challenging people or working in a group setting or team-based? And do you do any of that, either whether it be embedded or otherwise?
Right. Yes, we do, because obviously you need to prepare the students for that. So make sure that they do some group work in class anyway, and to see how they interact with each other. And then we also talk about resolution of conflicts, giving constructive feedback, and we do that in a very practical way. So I don't say, well, we're going to talk about this, but we as they give feedback to each other on tasks that we're actually doing in class, then that's when so I bring that out. And when you have a difficult group, and that's happening to me quite a lot, especially in the past with those students who are always inclined to you know, for more sort of legal arguments and this sort of thing. It's part of the discipline. We've discussed that with the different groups, for instance, and yes, and sometimes you do have to be a bit, be practical, and actually, not put students together, make choices, but I let the students choose their own groups anyway. So already, it's a self-selecting group. And occasionally, you've got students that have got difficulty engaging with the group. But I do stress to the students that part of the portfolio is actually being able to deal with conflict, because that's what they're going to have to do in the workplace anyway, well, in life generally, but certainly in the workplace. So that's part of their learning, and because it is part of the criteria as well, they sort of do their best to engage. But sometimes, and I have had to be a referee once as well, where things are really disintegrated.
Thank you.
Any other questions? One very briefly, you talked about emotions and emotional intelligence linked to engagement. Did you get any evidence that it improved the confidence of students?
Yes, and this was the main strength of the portfolio, for instance, because translation and interpreting, but particularly interpreting for weak students, is extremely challenging, because they do liaison interpreting. You've got one person speaking English, one person speaking the target language, and they've got to interpret between the two. And that, for weak students, is a huge challenge. And we found that doing it this way helped them a lot, because they had lots of practice, because they had peer feedback. It actually made a very big difference. The group translation also to weaker students in particular.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the second presentation. So the poster that I said wasn't in the room, it is in the room, so do have a look at it as you go out.